By the time the creek climbed over County Road 9, everyone in Willow Creek knew the valley was in trouble. For 3 days, the storm had hammered roofs, swallowed fence lines, ripped through roadside ditches, and turned clean fields into brown moving sheets. Farmers stood on porches in raincoats, watching seed, fertilizer, and topsoil disappear downhill like someone had pulled the bottom out of the county. When Hank Miller reached the rise above the Turner place, the worst had already passed. The road below him was still closed, and the ditches still ran high, but from that safe ridge, he could see Caleb Turner's whole farm spread out under a gray morning sky. He expected ruin. Everyone did. For months, they had laughed at it. Caleb had taken a failing 160-acre farm, the last piece of land his family still owned, and carved it full of holes. Not one pond, not a proper lake. 47 strange little ponds scattered across rises, gullies, low corners, and weed-choked strips where no sensible farmer would have wasted an afternoon. From the road, the place had looked less like a farm and more like a man losing an argument with the earth. People called it Turner's Swamp. They joked that the bank would soon own the only mosquito preserve in Missouri. At the feed store, men shook their heads over coffee and said grief had done something to Caleb after his father died. A farmer on the edge of foreclosure had no business spending his last dollars digging basins and planting grass around them. But that morning, Hank saw something he could not explain. The storm had not crossed Caleb's farm in one violent line. The upper ponds were full to their rims. The grassed spillways lay flattened but unbroken. Brown runoff rested in basins that had once been the county joke. Dark silt had settled in fans behind the catch ponds instead of being carried into the creek. The lower fields were bruised, soaked, and littered with branches, but they were not carved open the way Hank's fields were. Across the road, worked acreage had been ripped apart. On Caleb Turner's land, speed had been taken away from disaster. Near the barn, Caleb stood beneath the open shed door, not out in the current, not fighting the flood with a shovel like a fool, but watching what the storm had left behind. His coat was wet, his boots were caked with slick clay, his face looked exhausted, yet the farm around him had done what he had spent 3 years teaching it to do. It had slowed the storm down before the storm could take everything. The question that would haunt Willow Creek after that morning was not whether Caleb had lost his mind. The question was how he had seen the flood coming before the sky ever broke. Caleb Turner had never been the kind of man people expected to surprise them. He was quiet, broad-shouldered, and steady in the old rural way, the kind of man who fixed a gate before talking about feelings and measured bad news by how much work it would take to survive it. He had grown up on the Turner farm outside Willow Creek, where the land began to roll toward the Ozarks and the soil changed from deep bottomland to thin red clay over stone. His grandfather had bought the first 80 acres after the war. His father, Earl Turner, had doubled it in better years, back when the farm still seemed strong enough to carry 3 generations. They raised corn, hay, a few cattle, and the kind of pride that made men pretend exhaustion was just another season. But by the time Caleb inherited the farm, pride was almost the only thing left unbroken. Earl died in February after years of lung disease, leaving behind a worn Bible, a drawer full of seed receipts, a tractor that started only when it wanted to, and a stack of bank letters Caleb had already read too many times. The house felt larger after Earl was gone. Every room held the shape of him: the chair by the window, the coffee cup with a cracked handle, the faded coat still hanging beside the back door. The farm itself looked tired. The upper fields had been plowed hard for decades. Heavy weather carried soil downhill. Dry summers baked the clay until it cracked. The barn roof leaked over the hayloft. The north fence sagged. The old combine smoked whenever Caleb pushed it past half throttle. Every repair revealed another repair waiting behind it. The last 3 years had nearly finished them. First came drought. Crop leaves curled tight and silver in the heat. Then came spring storms that washed young seed out of the ground. Then prices fell. At the same time, fertilizer and diesel climbed. Caleb sold cattle to cover interest. He sold equipment he had once sworn never to sell, He stopped buying new parts and began rebuilding old ones from scrap. After Earl's funeral, Caleb's daughter Maggie came home from Springfield and found the kitchen table covered in envelopes. She was 21, studying environmental science and trying very hard to be brave for a father who looked like he had aged 10 years in one winter. She made coffee, sat across from him, and did not speak until the silence became unbearable. She told him selling some land was not betrayal. She told him her grandfather would not want him crushed beneath debt. She told him there were jobs in Springfield where a man could sleep at night without listening for the weather. Caleb looked out the window at the fields, gray under the February sky. He did not argue with her. That was what made it worse. Maggie had expected stubbornness. Instead, she saw a man who understood every word and still could not let go. The farm was not just land to him. It was Earl teaching him to drive a tractor in low gear. It was Maggie, as a little girl, running barefoot through sweet corn. It was his grandfather setting fence posts by hand. It was every turner who had put a back, a shoulder, a season, and a prayer into that soil and believed the next year might be kinder. But memory did not pay the bank. In March, Mr. Holloway called Caleb into his office. He was polite, which somehow hurt more than if he had been cruel. He spread the papers on the desk and said the farm needed a real plan by harvest, not hope, not tradition, a plan. Caleb drove home with both hands tight on the wheel. That evening, a hard storm crossed the valley. It was not the great flood yet, not even close. Just an ordinary Missouri beating, loud on the roof and gone before midnight. But the next morning, Caleb walked the farm because sitting in the house felt worse than facing the damage. He followed the water's path. At the top of the south field, runoff moved fast through last year's stubble. Halfway down the grade, it joined another stream, darker now, carrying loose soil. Near the broken gate, it widened and cut a fresh channel through the planting ground. By the time it reached the creek, the flow was thick and brown. Caleb stood there with drops falling from the brim of his cap, watching his farm leave him one handful at a time. For years, he had thought his problem was not enough water. In July, that was true. The ground dried hard. Crops suffered. Pastures browned. But in that moment, staring at the muddy creek, he saw the cruelty more clearly. The farm did get water. It simply could not hold it. Storms came hard, struck bare ground, ran downhill, stole soil, carried away fertility, and vanished. Then summer came, and Caleb paid to replace what the wet season had taken. That night, he did not sleep. He pulled out Earl's old notebooks and spread them across the kitchen table. Most of the pages were ordinary farmer records, planting dates, fuel costs, repair notes, equipment troubles. But here and there, Earl had written observations that Caleb had never noticed before. The lower hay patch stayed green after pond overflow. Grass strips slowed wash near the creek. Low corner held moisture into August. On one page, beside a hand-drawn map of the farm after a storm in 1986, Earl had written one sentence. "Water always tells the truth." Caleb read it again and again. In the weeks that followed, he began walking the farm differently, not like a man looking for a place to plant, but like a man trying to understand where the land hurt. He watched where runoff gathered, where it moved too fast, where it cut, where it sank, where weeds grew greener without help. He knelt in wet earth. He marked grades with flags. He paced gullies with a notebook in his pocket. Maggie noticed the change when she came home for a weekend. Her father was no longer only worried, he was listening. He showed her the map on the kitchen table. 47 circles marked the farm from the upper pasture to the creek bottom. Maggie stared at them. They were not random. Some sat above gullies, some rested below grades, some connected to grassed strips, some were tiny catch basins, others looked like shallow bowls. Caleb explained in his plain way. He did not talk like a scientist. He talked like a farmer who had watched too much good dirt wash away. He said he wanted to slow the water before it became strong enough to steal from him. He wanted the silt to settle on his land instead of in the creek. He wanted roots around the ponds, shade on the soil, insects and birds back in the fields. He wanted the farm to stop bleeding. Maggie listened carefully. Part of her understood. Another part saw the bank letters, the broken machinery, the empty cattle lot. She asked him what happened if he was wrong. Caleb folded the map and looked toward the dark window. Then he said if he kept doing everything the old way, he already knew how the story ended. The first excavation began the following Monday. The news spread before the diesel smoke cleared. A farmer in debt was digging ponds instead of planting more acres. He was renting equipment instead of buying fertilizer. He was giving land back to grass when every acre was supposed to earn. For a few days, the laughter was almost friendly. Men slowed their trucks and called out jokes. Someone left a hand-painted sign near the road that read, "Turner's Fishing Resort." Caleb took it down without comment. Then the jokes sharpened. At the feed store, people said Earl would be ashamed. Someone said Maggie should come take his checkbook away. Someone else said, grief made men do foolish things. Caleb heard most of it. He answered none of it. By late May, the first storms tested the ponds, and the farm seemed to prove the critics right. The first pond did not fail dramatically. It failed quietly, which was worse. Caleb had shaped it too steep, too clean, too much like a hole, and not enough like part of the land. After a night of heavy weather, he found the bank slumped into the basin. Water had chewed around the side and cut a fresh channel below it. The muddy scar looked like laughter made visible. He stood there for a long time with a shovel in his hand. That same week, Pond 3 leaked through a vein of gravel and would not hold. Pond 7 filled with silt after one storm until it looked less like a pond than a grave for Caleb's last money. Pond 12 became exactly what people had joked it would become, a buzzing, miserable cloud of mosquitoes. At first, Caleb treated each failure like a repair job. He moved dirt, he packed clay, he carried stones, he seeded grass. But the problems kept coming. A spillway clogged, a bank cracked, a shallow basin dried too fast. A wet lane swallowed the tractor tire up to the axle. One afternoon, he spent 4 hours in 90-degree heat digging out a culvert by hand, only to watch another storm undo half the work before morning. The pressure did not stay in the fields. It followed him into the house. Bills sat on the kitchen table. The bank wanted progress. The tractor needed a part he could not afford. The barn roof leaked harder every season. Maggie called from Springfield and tried to sound hopeful, but Caleb could hear the fear she was hiding. One evening in July, after Pond 19 broke during a thunderstorm, Caleb reached the edge of what he could carry. The storm had come fast, just before sunset. He ran out in a soaked flannel shirt and tried to clear the overflow, but the weak place had already given way. Water tore through the bank, brown and angry, carrying new grass seed, clay, and stone into the lower field. Caleb slipped in the wet earth, fell to one knee, and drove his hand into the flow as if he could hold the farm together by force. By dark, he was sitting on the floor of the machine shed, soaked, shaking from cold and anger. Slick clay covered his jeans. His hands were bleeding in 2 places. The shovel lay beside him. For the first time, he said the words out loud. Maybe they were right. No one heard him except the storm. He looked across the shed at Earl's old coat hanging on a nail. For a moment, he hated the farm, hated its debt, hated its stubborn grades, hated every memory that made it impossible to walk away. Then headlights swept across the shed wall. Maggie had driven from Springfield through the storm. She found him sitting there in the dark and did not say anything at first. She simply took off her jacket, wrapped it around his shoulders, and sat beside him on the cold concrete. For a long while, they listened to water strike the roof. Caleb finally told her he had ruined everything. Maggie looked at his hands, at the clay on his boots, at the old coat on the wall. She was afraid. He could see that, but she did not tell him to quit. Instead, she asked him to show her what went wrong. The next morning, they walked to Pond 19 together. The storm had passed. Mist hung low over the pasture. Caleb expected only damage, but Maggie crouched near the broken bank and pointed to a fan of dark silt caught in the grass below the spillway. It had not all washed away. Some of it had stopped. That small fact changed the morning. Caleb saw the failure differently. The pond had broken, yes, but before it broke, it had slowed the water. The grass had caught soil. The stone had worked until the overflow clogged. The idea had not failed completely. His design had. That distinction kept him going. From then on, Maggie became more than the daughter asking him to survive. She became his second set of eyes. On weekends, she came home with work gloves, old jeans, and questions from classes she was beginning to connect to the farm. She did not turn the place into a research project. She helped make it understandable. She drew cleaner maps. She marked where frogs appeared. She noticed which grass held after storms, and which washed flat. She argued with Caleb when he wanted to rebuild too fast. He argued back when she trusted theory more than the evidence under their boots. Their relationship changed in the fields. For years, Caleb had protected Maggie from the farm's hardest truths. Now she was standing in them beside him. She saw the bank letters. She saw the failed ponds. She saw the way he limped after long days. And he saw that she was no longer a child trying to escape the farm. She was a young woman, deciding whether the place could have a future worth returning to. Together, they stopped trying to force the ponds into neat shapes. They let the land decide more. Where water came fast, they widened the approach. Where banks slumped, they softened the edges. Where silt collected, they made a small catch basin above the main pond. Around the edges, they planted deep-rooted grasses and clover. On the steeper fields, Caleb reduced plowing. In winter, he let cover crops hold the soil like a living blanket. He did not explain these changes with big words. He learned them through consequence. Bare ground broke, covered ground held, straight water cut, slowed water settled. Dead edges bred mosquitoes. Living edges brought frogs, dragonflies, swallows, and balance. The farm still looked strange, but less desperate. By the end of the second year, the signs were small enough that only someone walking slowly would notice. The creek ran clearer after ordinary storms. The lower field no longer crusted as badly. Grass thickened around the ponds. Earthworms appeared in soil that had once crumbled into lifeless dust. In August, when nearby pastures browned early, strips near Caleb's water system stayed green a little longer. A little longer did not sound like much. To Caleb, it sounded like a door opening. The bank still waited, the debt still pressed. Neighbors still doubted him, though the jokes had lost their teeth. The farm was not saved. It was simply no longer dying in the same direction. Then came the spring flood. It began as a blessing. After a dry winter, everyone welcomed the first wet weeks. Then the next storm came. Then the next. The ground filled. Ditches ran high. The creek rose into the sycamores. Weather reports spoke of stalled systems and record totals. But in Willow Creek, people needed no report. They could hear trouble overhead. On the third night, Maggie called from Springfield. Caleb could barely hear her over the weather. She told him she was coming home. He told her the roads were bad. She came anyway. By dawn, the Turner farm was under attack. Runoff rushed from the upper pasture in a brown sheet. Caleb and Maggie moved only along the safe high paths they had marked the year before, checking what they could without stepping into moving water. They cleared debris where the flow was shallow enough to approach and backed away where it was not. Their clothes clung to them. Maggie's hair was plastered under her hood. Caleb's hands were numb. Twice, thunder cracked so close the ground seemed to jump. Pond 1 filled and spilled, but held. Pond 3, once useless from leaks, now acted as a shallow spreader, slowing the first rush before it reached the lower grade. Pond 7 caught a load of silt so thick it looked like wet chocolate, but its rebuilt banks did not break. At Pond 19, Caleb stopped. This was the one that had nearly ended him, the one that had broken him down on the machine shed floor, the one Maggie had helped him understand. Now the storm poured into it, rose, swirled, and found the stone spillway. For one terrible second, Caleb thought it would fail again. The level climbed higher, grass flattened, brown water boiled at the edge. Then the flow shifted. It poured over the spillway exactly where he had guided it, spread into the grass below, lost speed, and moved on. Maggie grabbed his arm. Neither of them spoke. There was no triumph in that moment, only awe, fear, and the fragile realization that 3 years of work were standing between the farm and ruin. Not every pond survived perfectly. One small basin near the west pasture blew out. A grass strip tore loose below the old lane. The road to the barn washed in 2 places, but the system as a whole held. The flood did not find one clean path to destroy the farm. It was interrupted again and again, forced to pause, forced to drop what it carried, forced to spend its strength before it reached the creek. Across the valley, the damage was brutal. Fields planted early were sliced open, seed washed away, fresh fertilizer ran into ditches, low ground disappeared under sand and debris. Hank Miller lost a section of soybean field to a gully deep enough to stand in. The Jenkins family had to move cattle to higher ground. Roads were closed, fences vanished. Men who had farmed for 40 years stood at field edges with the stunned faces of people seeing their land changed overnight. When the storm finally ended, Willow Creek looked bruised. Caleb's farm looked battered too. It was torn in places and covered with debris, but it was still whole. The 47 ponds were full. The sediment basins held rich, dark soil that would once have been gone forever. The grass buffers lay flattened but rooted. The lower fields were wet, not gutted. The creek below the Turner place ran clearer than anyone expected after a flood like that. By afternoon, sunlight broke through the clouds. It touched the ponds one by one until they shone like small pieces of sky trapped in the land. That was when the road grew quiet. People no longer slowed down to laugh. They slowed down because they were trying to understand. The real reward did not come the next day. It came over the next season, then the next. That was what made it real. While other farmers spent weeks repairing gullies and reworking ruined fields, Caleb and Maggie repaired the damaged ponds and used what the flood had left behind. They spread captured silt over thin patches. They fixed spillways. They reseeded grass. They planted later than planned, but into soil that still held moisture and had not been stripped to clay. When summer turned dry, the difference became visible. Crops on Caleb's protected fields stayed green longer. Hay came thicker in the lower pasture. Pest pressure eased near the ponds where swallows and dragonflies hunted over the grass. His fertilizer bill dropped because the soil was no longer losing as much every storm. His yields did not explode like a fairy tale, but they rose steadily, and his costs fell at the same time. For a farmer on the edge, that combination was more valuable than a record crop. At harvest, Caleb paid the bank on time. Then he repaired the barn roof. Maggie found him standing in the kitchen that evening after the last sheet of tin was fastened down, listening to the weather pass overhead without a single drip hitting the floor. For years, every storm had entered that house one leak at a time. Now the roof held. She smiled and said Grandpa would have pretended not to cry. Caleb looked up at the ceiling, then out through the window toward the dark shapes of the ponds. He said Earl would have complained the screws were crooked, then gone outside anyway to see where the water settled. Maggie laughed, but Caleb's voice stayed quiet. That was what the farm had taught them both. You did not fix a life by stopping the sky from breaking open. You fixed it by giving what fell a place to go. Recognition came slowly, the way trust does in farming communities. Hank Miller came first, though he nearly talked himself out of it at the gate. He found Caleb mending fence near Pond 3 and asked, awkwardly, whether he could see how the water moved. Caleb could have reminded him of every joke. He could have made the moment small and sharp. He did not. He opened the gate. After Hank came 2 other neighbors. Then the county extension agent. Then a group from the university where Maggie had studied. But the visits never became a victory parade. Caleb hated being treated like a genius. He insisted on showing failures first. He showed the pond that leaked, the bank that broke, the spillway he rebuilt 3 times. He showed them where he had guessed wrong, where Maggie had corrected his map, where grass had done more work than equipment, where patience had saved money that pride would have wasted. Maggie began organizing the farm records, but not as a cold stack of numbers. She turned them into a story the community could use: repairs, yield changes, soil improvements, mistakes, costs, and lessons. She helped farmers see that the 47 ponds were not a trick to copy exactly. They were proof of a different way to think. Every farm had its own water, its own grades, its own wounds. The point was not to imitate Caleb's map. The point was to learn how to watch. Over the next years, Turner Farm changed from a warning into a destination. Some farmers dug small basins, some planted grassed waterways, some stopped plowing their steepest fields. Some tried cover crops for the first time. Hank Miller restored a bad washout he had fought for a decade. He never gave a dramatic apology, but one morning he brought Caleb a thermos of coffee and asked whether switchgrass would hold better than fescue on a south-facing bank. Caleb took the coffee. That was apology enough. 5 years after the first pond was dug, the most dangerous debt was gone. Caleb did not celebrate with a new truck or a vacation. He replaced the cracked kitchen window Earl had always meant to fix. Maggie teased him for calling that a celebration, but later that evening, she stood beside him and looked through the clear glass toward the lower fields. The ponds were copper in the sunset. Frogs called from the wet edges. Swallows cut through the air. Grass moved in the wind where bare soil had once baked and washed away. The house could see the farm clearly again. Years passed, and the 47 ponds settled into the land as if they had been waiting there all along. Their banks softened. Native grasses deepened. Cottonwoods rose in a few wet corners. Quail returned to the field edges. Children from the local school came with jars and notebooks, kneeling beside the ponds to study tadpoles, insects, roots, and wet earth. Maggie, now running more of the farm each year, taught them that soil was not dirt to be used up, and water was not an enemy to be rushed away. Caleb grew older. His hair went fully gray. He moved slower, but he still walked the farm after every storm. His clothes changed with the seasons: flannel in November, denim in March, sweat-stained cotton in July, but the notebook remained in his pocket. Sometimes he stood by Pond 19 longer than the others, remembering the night he almost quit, and the daughter who had driven through a storm to sit beside him in the dark. People sometimes asked whether he was proud that he had proved everyone wrong. Caleb never liked that question. It made the story too small. He had not saved the farm by defeating his neighbors. He had saved it by listening longer than his fear wanted him to. The banker had not been a villain. The neighbors had not been villains. Even the men who laughed had only believed what they had been taught to believe. Keep fields clean, move water away, buy what the soil lacks, and push harder next year. Caleb had believed much of that once too. The land simply forced him to learn humility. Near the end of his farming years, Caleb gave Maggie the notebooks. They were stained, bent, and crowded with maps, dates, mistakes, seed mixes, repairs, and observations written in pencil. Inside the first cover, beneath the original drawing of 47 circles, Caleb had written one sentence for her. "Do not force the land to obey before you have learned what it is trying to become." That became the quiet legacy of Turner Farm. Not a fortune built overnight, not a miracle, not revenge against the people who laughed. Its legacy was a living farm where a dying one had stood. A daughter who came home not out of guilt but belief. A valley that learned to slow water instead of fear it. A community that began to understand that patience could be practical, humility could be profitable, and nature often answers only after people stop shouting instructions at it. The ponds they mocked became the reason the Turner name stayed on the mailbox. The weeds they hated became the roots that held the valley's future in place. And the flood they feared became the witness that proved Caleb had not been fighting nature at all. He had been listening. Sometimes the idea everyone laughs at is not foolish. Sometimes it is simply early. And when it is built with observation, work, patience, and respect for the living world, What looks like madness today can become the wisdom that saves tomorrow.